change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind if it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
But Jesus, he was not only the hope of Israel, but Jesus is this woman's only hope, because this woman's life is a daily hell, because she has what they call here a severely demon-possessed daughter. And all this makes me think about is that movie that came out in the 70s when I was a teenager, and y'all know the movie that I'm talking about. And when I think of severely demon-possessed, I think of that movie. And you might wonder and you might think, well, how does such a young girl become so severely demon-possessed? Well, I don't know. I don't know how these things happen, but I do know that they do happen. But you have to also remember that here that the Canaanites, these people, they weren't Jews, and they served idols, and that was their religious practices. And behind every idol, there were demons, and they worshiped them. And so demons, they were the gods that they served, and they were the gods that they worshiped. And it's possible that this girl, she had served these idols in some of their perverted and sometimes or even sexual practices. But we don't know what happened here. But she could have been exposed to some type of cultish ritual or some type of fortune-telling rituals. And it's possible she could have even been exposed to these things by her very own mother. And so maybe her mother, she's even bearing quite a bit of guilt of what's happened to her little girl. But however it's happened, this is the kind of mother you would want to have, because this woman, she's relentless. And she will fight for this little girl until she gets what her little girl needs. And so this woman, she's heard of Jesus and his ability to cast out demons, which means that she has probably heard of Jesus's Galilean ministry. And so she may possibly even know that he not only heals Jews, but he'll also heal Gentiles, because people were coming down from this area, from Tyre and Sidon, down into the Galilee to be healed. Because Jesus, he was the talk of the whole region. And now you have Jesus, and now Jesus, he's in her neighborhood, and she's not going to let him go. And so she's crying behind him, and she's begging him repeatedly over and over, because this woman, she's not going to give up. And she's not asking for anything for herself. She's asking for mercy for her daughter, because this woman loves her daughter so much, and she can't stand the thoughts of how those demons have treated her daughter. But Jesus, he ignores her, and he just keeps on walking as if the woman wasn't there. But the disciples, they don't have that same type of tolerance for this woman as Jesus does. And so they're annoyed because they don't have the patience of Jesus. They may also be prejudiced because she's not only just a woman, but she's a Canaanite. So she's a Gentile. And so they may have quite a bit of prejudice there. And they don't plead for Jesus to go and to heal her daughter, but all they're asking him to do is to get rid of her, to send her away, because the disciples, they have no love for this woman. And so now after these disciples, after their hearts are exposed, Jesus, he doesn't do what they say. But now he turns around to this woman and he tells her that he wasn't sent to the Gentiles, that he was only sent to the lost sheep, to the house of Israel. And so now you have this woman, and she has just been denied. And what she doesn't argue with him. She doesn't plead with him of why he should heal her daughter. And she doesn't call him names. She doesn't call him a racist. what she does is she worships him. And then after she worships him, she prays. And her prayer is a lot like Peter's prayer that we read last week. Just 3 little words. It's, Lord, help me. And so then after this and after her prayer, what Jesus does is he calls her a dog. And the Jews, they always called Gentiles dogs. But this isn't Israel. This isn't their own country. But this area still is mixed with Gentiles and Jews. And this woman, she's been called a dog before. And it might be a little hard for us to realize that Jesus called her a dog. And you might think in your mind, well, is Jesus a little bit racist? But she doesn't turn around and she doesn't say, I don't think I heard you right. Did you just call me what I thought you called me? You didn't just call me a dog. But the truth is, Jesus didn't use the same word for dog that the Jews used for calling Gentiles dogs. The Jews, when they called somebody a dog, they called them the garbage-eating curs that were vicious, that would roam the streets, and they would attack anything they'd see. Jesus, all he did is he called her a little household dog. He called her a pet dog, the kind of dog that would sit on the master's lap. And then what Jesus says, that would have been understood by anybody in any culture, because nobody would ever take the bread away from their little children and go feed the pet dogs with the children's bread and leave their children hungry with no food. And this woman, she also understood that the Jews were the children of God and that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, that he was sent to the Jews. And even though Jesus has healed Gentiles before, he has never healed Gentiles in a Gentile country. And I think here, Jesus, he doesn't want to be misunderstood, as if he had left the Jews and now he's going to the Gentiles, that his mission to Israel was over. But even here again, this woman, she doesn't argue with Jesus. She accepted her place. She knew that she wasn't one of the children of Israel, and that she wasn't entitled to any miracle from him. And this woman, she understands that Jesus has a special calling to the Jews, and she didn't want to take anything away from them. She didn't want to take anything away from the children of Israel. And so then what she does is she just acknowledges, yeah, I'm just a little dog. I'm not a Jew. And she can't change her race. But even so, she still calls Jesus Lord again. And now she says, I'm just asking for the crumbs, for those crumbs that the children don't want, just the stuff that falls on the floor. So she's not wanting to take anything away from the children, but she just wants a little blessing alongside of them. And then Jesus says she has great faith. And this is the second person that Jesus has ever said that had great faith. The first person that he said had great faith was the centurion when he healed the centurion's servant. And now it's this woman. And if you notice, both of them were Gentiles. And both of them were not asking for anything for themselves. They were both asking for something for somebody else. They were asking for something for someone they loved. And so I don't think Jesus, that he used any harsh tones when he talked to this woman, when he was speaking to her. And I also believe that Jesus intended to heal this woman's daughter all along. In fact, I believe that's the only reason that he's even up there. And that this whole dialogue was to draw out this woman's confession of faith. And I believe that Jesus, that he wanted to do this miracle in front of his disciples, because this was going to be the kind of people that they would be ministering to. They would be just like this woman. They would be idolatrous Gentiles who were lost. And the way you can prove that this is the whole reason that Jesus went up there to Tyre and Sidon to meet this one woman is because that's the only person he healed up there. The only person he healed up there was her daughter. And after he heals the daughter, he goes back down into Israel, into the area of the Decapolis, which is 10 cities. Well, that's what Decapolis means, 10 cities. And so now he goes back down into Israel, but now they're not on the western part of Israel, on the western part of the Sea of Galilee. They're on the eastern side, which is mainly all made up of Gentiles, even though it was Jewish. And so now Jesus, he's healing all these Gentiles. And again, the multitudes are gathering around him, and they're bringing everybody who's sick, maimed, mute, lame, blind. And again, Jesus, he's healing all of them. And it says that these Gentiles are amazed. And it doesn't say that they went and they glorified their gods, but it says that they're glorifying the God of Israel because they've never seen anything like this. And so now Jesus, he remains with these people for 3 days, and they've used up all their food reserves. In this case, we're told that he's in the wilderness. In fact, they're up in the mountains, and that there is no town nearby to get any food. And they've traveled very far to go see Jesus. And of course, they were very glad to do that because they stayed a very long time. And what you need to see here is that Jesus, he loves these people just as much as he loves the Jews. And he didn't want to send them away hungry or weak. And again, it says that Jesus has compassion for the multitude. And he uses that same word that he used the last time when he said he had compassion when he fed the 5,000 Jews. And that word meant that he was moved inward in his inward parts, which again, it means this is much more than just having sympathy. Because Jesus, he feels the same way about these Gentile crowds as he felt toward the Jewish crowds, those ones that wanted to make Jesus the bread king. And so here again, it's Jesus is the one who says he doesn't want to send them away hungry. And then his disciples, they say to him, well, where can we get enough bread in the wilderness? And you have to think, well, don't you remember last week you fed the 5,000? And you would think that these guys would start to get it. And then there's these commentaries, and these are not the good commentaries, but there are commentaries, and they'll say that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, that it's the same event, it's just being mentioned twice. And they say that's because the feeding of the 4,000, it isn't mentioned in all the four Gospels like the feeding of the 5,000, that this is only mentioned in Matthew and in Mark. But there's a lot of differences between the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And the first one is very obvious. It's 1,000 people. There's 1,000 people. And this one, it also occurred on the east side. And it didn't occur by the cities. It occurred in the mountains in the wilderness. And with the 5,000, it was primarily Jews. And the word that they used for baskets in the feeding of the 5,000 is a different word for basket that they use here. And that word for basket with the feeding of the 5,000, that was a smaller Jewish basket. And it's a basket that's made and it tapers up to the top because it has a small hole on the top. And that's because of the Jews' purity rules for food. But the word for basket used here with the feeding of the 4,000, this is a large basket, and it actually looks more like a mat with just kind of like a little flare around it, like a little lip. And that's the kind of baskets that the Gentiles use. And then in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus, he divided up 5 loaves and 2 small fish. And the leftovers that the disciples gathered was 12 baskets. But here with the 4,000, they started with 7 loaves and a few fish, and then they had 7 baskets left over. But what the similarities between these two events is that everybody, they overate, and that everybody was filled. And that's the truth. With Jesus, he can always satisfy us all. So after the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus, he leaves the east side of the Galilee and he travels to the town of Magdala. And Magdala is the town where Mary Magdalene was from, which is on the northwest side of the Galilee. And now we hear for the first time that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they have come together to test Jesus. And them coming together against Jesus, it shows us how much they consider Jesus to be a threat to them. Because you see, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were enemies. Their views on everything they believed were opposite. And the Sanhedrin, the 70, the ruling council in Israel that was in Jerusalem, they were made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees, both of these parties. But the only thing that bound these two parties together here was their fear and their hatred toward Jesus. Now, the Pharisees, they weren't a political party. They could live under any governmental rule as long as they were left alone to be able to practice their views of religion. But the Sadducees, they were political. And they were also the aristocrats. I've seen the movie just too many times, but they were the aristocrats of Israel's society, but they were the people of power and of wealth. And so these guys, they made deals with the Romans to be able to keep their power and their wealth. So the Pharisees, they would have been considered to have been the conservatives because these guys, they believed in all of the Old Testament scriptures. And the party itself was made up of any male Jew who wanted to follow their way of life and their teachings. But these people, they were also the legalists. And their rabbis, they were the ones who had made up these rules upon rules for everybody to follow. They burdened the people with rules. But they also believed in miracles, and they believed in angels, and they also believed in a resurrection. Where the Sadducees, they believed in none of that. They believed the exact opposite. They didn't believe in miracles, and they didn't believe in angels, and they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They only believed in what you could see with your own two eyes, and they were considered to be the liberals. They only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They only believed in the writings of Moses, and they accepted nothing from the books of the prophets or from the Psalms or from the Proverbs or anything that wasn't written by Moses. And they weren't just made up of anyone. They were mostly made up of those who descended from the line of the priests, from the line of Aaron, Moses' brother. All the high priests, they were Sadducees, and they ran the big business in the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, the name Sadducee is derived from the name Zadok, which was the first high priest that served in Solomon's temple. And the only thing that these groups could agree on is that Jesus was a threat to their business of religion, and they needed an alliance to be able to take him down because they were afraid that Jesus would end up ruling Israel. But where Jesus came to rule, he didn't come here to rule in Jerusalem. Jesus, where he came to rule in the hearts of men and women. He wasn't trying to conquer the land, but he was trying to conquer the people in the battlegrounds of their own individual hearts to those who would receive him willingly, those who needed a savior. Because Jesus, he has the power to transform lives from death to life. And so now this alliance of Sadducees and Pharisees, they come together, and now they're asking Jesus for a sign from heaven. And this word means much more than just a miracle, because they've seen sufficient miracles and they're dismissing all of them. And that's even though those miracles that they saw were actually the direct fulfillment of all the prophecies of the Messiah that they found in the scriptures. But now what they're doing is they're asking him for a demonstration of power. They're asking for an astronomical sign, like something like bringing fire down from the skies. And they're saying to him, if we see this, we will believe you're the Messiah. And this is the second time that the Pharisees had come to Jesus and asked for this type of sign. The first time was back in chapter 12. And then Jesus confronts them here and he says, well, you guys, you can discern the signs of the sky about weather And that's kind of like our saying that we have: red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in morn, sailor take warn or be warned. Or I was never a sailor. I don't know those sayings real well. I've heard it though. And he was telling them that where they could tell that a storm was coming by the color of the sky, but now they can't see and discern the coming of the Messiah. And what they were ignoring here was way much more than just the color of the sky, because they're having to ignore what they see, and they're also having to ignore the scriptures, because they are seeing the scriptures fulfilled. And just like the first time when they asked Jesus for a sign, Jesus here, he gives them the same answer that he gave to them the first time. He says that the only sign they're going to get is a sign of Jonah. And he was talking about his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And it'll all happen in 3 days. And all of these guys, they will live long enough to see this sign, because this is about to happen in less than a year. And if you ever notice, Jesus never terrified people into believing in him by signs of power, by pulling the fire out of the sky. And he can do stuff like that. But Jesus, he draws people to himself by relieving them from their burdens in life and by loving them. And that's because Jesus is gentle, because Jesus is a shepherd. And so Jesus, he doesn't stay and he doesn't argue with the Pharisees and Sadducees. He leaves them and he goes to the other side of Galilee. Okay, now the disciples, when they catch up with Jesus, Jesus tries to tell them about this encounter he just had with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Jesus tries to warn his disciples about their false doctrines and their false teachings. And Jesus, he describes it to them just like that parable of that small amount of leaven that the woman placed in the 3 measures of meal, which ended up corrupting all the meal. And so Jesus, he warns his disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees, because what they're teaching is spiritual corruption. And leaven is always the symbol of an evil influence. But these guys, his disciples, well, they're not on the same page as Jesus, and they're not understanding him at all. Because as soon as Jesus said the word leaven, all they started thinking about is how they forgot to bring the bread. And so these guys, they can't understand spiritual things that Jesus is saying, because their minds are set on the earthly things. Their minds are set on lunch. And they're not even going to the place where they're even asking Jesus what he's talking about. Because it says, they're just talking among themselves, and they're trying to figure it all out on their own. And so the best thing that they could come up with on their own was, well, Jesus, he's just upset that we didn't bring any bread, until Jesus interrupts them, because Jesus, he knows what they're thinking. And then Jesus calls them, you of little faith. So he calls them little faith. And it seems like this happens to be a name that he's starting to call them on a regular basis. He's not calling them no faith, but little faith. And that's because he wants to develop them to be men of great faith, like the centurion and like the Canaanite woman.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,